The last silver dollar left Della Voss's hand and dropped into the bankman's open palm. She did not cry. She had counted every coin in that store since before she could see over the counter. And she counted these too, clean and slow, so no man could say a Voss shorted a debt. Then she reached up. She took down the brass bell her mother had rung for 20 years. She held it against her chest while they nailed the auction bill to the door she had swept every morning of her life. The bank's collector was a man named Harlan Pruitt. He stood on the porch in a good hat and looked out at the 40 neighbors gathered in the road. Every one of them had eaten through 2 bad winters on the credit she carried in her father's ledger. Not one of them could meet her eye. Pruitt tipped his hat to her, easy as Sunday. "A woman's got no note worth carrying, Miss Voss," he said. 2 counties over, a farmer named Silas Renner read her name on a copy of that same auction notice. He looked from the paper to his own feed store, weeks from the same nail and the same door. Then he hitched his team in the dark and drove all night to ask a stranger a question he was ashamed to say out loud. If you believe love is built with 2 pairs of hands, this story is for you. Before we go on, subscribe and tell me in the comments the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let me tell you how a bought marriage became the busiest counter in Harmon County. Della Voss learned figures before she learned her letters. Her father used to set her on a flour sack behind the counter and let her stack the pennies while he weighed out cornmeal. By 9, she kept the daybook. By 15, she ran the whole ledger, every account in the valley, in a small, clean hand that never blotted. Folks said Old Man Voss had the kindest heart in Corliss and no head for money at all, and that both those things were true, and that the reason the store lasted was the girl. She was 30 the winter it ended. Her father had been dead a year. The Continental Farmers Trust of Omaha held the paper. And when the price of corn fell through the floor, the trust called it, and there was no amount of clean bookkeeping that could pay a debt in a year when nobody had a dime. She watched it go. Worse, she watched what went with it. Every farmer she had carried lost his line of credit the same day, because a country store's ledger is the only bank a poor man ever sees. The Dabneys, the Crolls, the Hendrys. Gone, all their little balances swept into Pruitt's cash box because Pruitt bought what the trust foreclosed, and Pruitt did not carry anyone. Cash on the barrel, or nothing. So Della had nothing but a trunk of clothes, her mother's bell, and a name that used to mean something. She took a room over the milliner's. She waited to find out what a woman was worth when she was no longer useful to anyone. That is when Silas Renner knocked. He came at first light with his hat already in his hands, which was a bad way to start, because a man holding his hat like that has already decided he is begging. He was tall and worn down at the shoulders. Salt was coming in at his temples, though he wasn't yet 40. He had a farmer's brown eyes and a mustache he kept trimmed, and nothing else about him tended to. He stood in her doorway and could not find the front of the thing he had come to say, so he said the back of it first. "I got no head for figures," he said. "Never did. My brother kept the store. He died in March. She waited. She was good at waiting. It's the feed and seed, over in the county seat," he went on. "Renner's. My brother built it. Half the valley buys their seed there on tab and pays at harvest, same as your daddy's place, and the notes come due and I can't make sense of the books to save my life, and if it goes under," he stopped. He looked at his hat. "If it goes under, there's no credit in Harmon County that isn't Harlan Pruitt's. And Pruitt don't carry a man. He owns him." "I know what Pruitt does," she said. "I heard you know books better than any bank clerk between here and Lincoln." He lifted his eyes. "I can't pay you a wage. I got no wage to pay. What I got is a roof and a name, and I'll give you both if you'll come keep that store alive." She understood him then, and the understanding was cold and clear as well water. "You're asking me to marry you." "I'm asking you to save a store," he said. "The marrying is just so the town leaves you be while you do it. A hired woman living in my back room, they'd talk her out of the county in a month. A wife, they leave alone. He turned the hat once in his hands. "I won't ask you for anything a wife's asked for. I give you my word on that. I need your head, Miss Voss. That's the whole of it. I need your head or 40 families lose the only man who'll let 'em plant on promises." She should have been insulted. She had spent a year bracing to be told she was worth only her arithmetic, and here was a stranger saying it out loud on her doorstep at dawn. But she had also spent a year with her hands empty, and there is a particular hunger in a mind that has always been allowed to work and is suddenly told to sit still. He was offering her a ledger. He didn't know it, but that was the only thing on earth he could have offered that she wanted. "I'll want to see the books first," she said. Something moved across his face that was almost hope and almost fear. "You'll come look? I'll come look. If the store can be saved, I'll marry you and save it. If it can't, I'll tell you the truth and you'll not have wasted a wife on a dead thing." She stepped back from the door. "Give me an hour to pack." They were married 3 days later in the courthouse at Corliss, with a clerk and a janitor for witnesses and no ring, because he could not spare the money and she would not let him pretend to. The whole ceremony took 4 minutes. She signed her name Della Voss and then Della Renner directly beneath it, so both would be on the county record, and thought that was as honest a marriage line as any. She brought one thing from her father's store into that new life: her mother's brass bell. She carried it wrapped in a dish towel, and when they reached the feed store that first evening, she set it on the counter by the register. She did not hang it over the door. She set it down silent. A bell that isn't earning its ring has no business hanging, she thought, and left it there like a promise she hadn't decided to keep. The store was worse than he'd said and better than she'd feared. Renner's Feed and Seed sat on the corner of Main and Depot in the county seat, a long plank building with a loading dock out back and a warped front door that stuck so bad you had to shoulder it. Inside it smelled of oats and leather and dust. The shelves were half empty. The stock that remained was good, though, and the location was good, hard by the rail spur, and the men trusted the name. What was killing it wasn't the goods. It was the books. He showed her the safe that first night, because he was an honest man and he wanted her to know exactly what she'd married into. He knelt and worked the dial and swung the heavy door and took the papers out one at a time and laid them on the counter under the lamp. "The store note," he said, setting down a folded sheet. "That's the whole trouble right there." He set down another. "Deed to the store building. My brother's, now mine. A third. Deed to the home place. Farms free and clear, been Renner land 40 years. My grandfather broke that ground. There was a fourth paper, folded small, tucked half under the deed to the farm. His hand went to it and then his hand came back. He picked it up quick with the others and squared them all together and pushed them into the safe and shut the door and spun the dial. It took no more than a breath. If she had not spent her whole life watching men's hands over a counter, she would not have marked it at all. She marked it. She did not say anything. It was his safe and his marriage of convenience, and a woman brought in for her arithmetic does not ask a man what he keeps folded in the dark. She told herself that. She would remember, later, that she told herself that. "I'll start on the ledger tonight," she said. The store note said $1,140 in a clerk's flat hand. 60 days. She read the date twice. And she understood, holding it under the lamp, that the man who held this note wanted it to fail. Nobody sets a country feed store a 60-day balloon in the fall of 1934 expecting to be paid. You set it that way to take the store. 2 days after the wedding, Harlan Pruitt came to make sure they knew it. He drove up in a good car and came through the stuck door like he owned the hinges and stopped when he saw her behind the counter. For just a moment his easy face was not easy. Then it was again. He knew her. He had counted the last of her father's silver into his own palm. "Well," he said, "Miss Voss. Or is it Mrs. Renner now?" Word travels. He looked around the shelves, slow, pricing everything. "Bought yourself a bookkeeper, Renner. Clever. Though I'd have thought a man in your spot would want a wife who came with money. not one the bank just turned out. "Was there something you needed to buy, Mr. Pruitt?" Della asked. "I've got nothing to buy here that I can't get cheaper at my own place," he said pleasantly. "I came about the note. 60 days, and I'd hate for it to slip a man's mind in all the excitement of a honeymoon." He set his card on the counter next to the silent brass bell. "Continental's given me the handling of some of their county paper. Neighborly of them. So when the note comes due, you'll be settling with me." He smiled at her. "You understand paper, I'm told. So you understand there's no shame in a store that can't be saved. Some things are just done." $1,140, Della said. 60 days. 58 now. "I can count," she said. "It's the one thing I've always been able to do." He tipped his hat, the same easy tip he'd given her on the ruined porch of her father's store, and went out. The door stuck behind him and he had to shoulder it, and that gave her a small and unworthy pleasure. That night she began. She turned the lamp up and then, thinking of the oil, turned it back down to a stub, and by that mean little light she took apart 2 years of Silas Renner's bookkeeping. It was not bookkeeping. It was a man's kind heart written down badly. Sales entered on the wrong side. Payments never posted. Whole accounts kept in his head and never written at all, so that a farmer would come and pay and Silas would nod and take the money and not mark it, and the ledger would go on saying the man owed. She found the store was carrying 40 accounts it had no record of collecting. Some of those men had money. Not all. These were hard times and most had nothing, but some had paid partway and been credited nothing, and some had never been asked because Silas was too soft to ask and too proud to admit he'd let it go. She worked until the window went gray. She made a clean new ledger, every account ruled and dated, every balance true. And when she was done she had found, on paper, nearly $400 in monies owed or owing that Silas had simply lost track of. Not enough to cover the note. But real. The first real footing under a sinking thing. She was rubbing the ache out of her eyes when he came down in the dark, moving quiet so as not to wake her, not knowing she'd never gone up. He stopped when he saw her at the counter with the lamp burned to nothing and the 2 ledgers side by side, the old ruin and the new order. "You been at it all night," he said. "Your brother kept a store on charity and memory," she said. "Charity's fine. Memory's not a system." She turned the new book toward him. "You've got 40 men on here you never once wrote down. Some of them can pay. I mean to find out which." He looked at the clean columns a long time. He was not a man who could read a ledger fast, but he could read that she'd done in one night what he could not have done in a year, and something in his face gave way. "There's coffee," he said. "I'll make coffee." "I don't drink coffee," she said. Never took to it. "Chicory, if you've got it." He didn't say anything. He made the chicory. She noticed he watched how she took it. Nothing in it. Black. And she thought no more of it. But the next morning there was a cup of chicory set by her elbow before she asked, and the morning after that, and she understood without either of them speaking of it that he had remembered. It was a small thing. In that cold store in that hard year it did not feel small. 3 mornings on, she needed him to lift 100 weight of seed she couldn't shift alone, and she opened her mouth to say Mr. Renner, the way she'd said it since the courthouse, and what came out was, "Silas, give me a hand with this." He came around the counter fast. But she saw him catch the name. She saw it land. He didn't grin. He wasn't a grinning man, but he carried that sack like it weighed nothing, and for the rest of that day he stood a little straighter in his own store. The trouble with a store that lives on credit is that credit lives on trust, and the men of Harmon County did not yet trust her. She learned how much they didn't at the co-op meeting. The County Grain Co-op met the 3rd Thursday of the month in the back of the Grange Hall, 40-odd farmers who bought together and sold together and had, for 2 generations, taken their seed on tab from Renner's and squared it at harvest. That tab was the store's whole life. Della came to the meeting with her new clean ledger under her arm to lay out the harvest terms for the coming season, and the moment she stepped into that hall of pipe smoke and wet wool, she felt every man in it decide something about her at once. Old Emmett Kroll, who chaired the co-op, was decent enough to look uncomfortable. The younger men were not. They wanted to know since when they took their terms from a woman, and a foreclosed one at that, a bank's leavings that Silas Renner had picked up cheap to keep his books. Nobody said the ugliest of it out loud. They didn't have to. It sat in the room. And Harlan Pruitt was there. He had no business at a co-op meeting, he wasn't a member, he was cash and carry, the enemy of the whole idea. But he'd come as a guest of one of the sour young men, and he stood at the back with his good hat and let the room do his work, and only when it had gone as far as it could on its own did he step forward and do a little more. "Nobody doubts the woman can add," Pruitt said, warm and reasonable, spreading his hands to the room. "That's not the question, is it? The question's whose name is on the paper. You lent your credit to Renner's father and to Renner's brother because you knew them. You knew their word. Now here's a note called in 60 days and a set of ledgers kept by a wife 2 weeks married that Renner picked out of the bank's scrap pile." He turned his reasonable face to Silas, who had gone dark red and could not find a word. "You lent your name to a set of ledgers, Renner. That's a thing a man ought to think hard about before he asks his neighbors to do the same." The room murmured. It was going to go bad. Silas opened his mouth and nothing came, because he was a private man and shame had him by the throat, and Della saw that if she waited for her husband to defend the arrangement it would die right there in the pipe smoke. So she stood up. She set the ledger on the table and opened it flat so the light fell on the columns, and she did not raise her voice. Because a raised voice in a room of men who've already decided is a voice they can dismiss. "Every man in this room can come look at these books," she said. "Not the front of them. All of them. Your account, your neighbors, the store's own note, what's owed and what's owing, in a hand you can read. Mr. Pruitt's never once let a farmer see his figures, and he never will. Because his whole business is that you don't know what you owe until he tells you." She let that sit. "Here's the difference between his ledger and mine, and you'll want to remember it come fall." She looked at Pruitt when she said the next part, and she said it plain. "You count what men owe. I count what they'll grow. Come harvest, we'll see which ledger the county pays first." The hall went quiet. Not persuaded. Quiet, which is different and better, because a quiet room is a room that stopped following the loudest man and started thinking. Emmett Kroll looked at her a long moment over his pipe. Then he got up, walked to the table, took the pen, and signed his name to the season's terms at the top of her clean page. "Renner Seed's been true 40 years, Emmett said to the room. "Not to her. I'll take my chances on the woman keeps the book true." He set the pen down. "Anybody else?" 2 more signed that night. Only 2. But 2 was not none, and none was what Pruitt had come for, and when Pruitt went out into the dark he did not tip his hat to anybody. Silas didn't speak the whole ride home. She thought maybe she'd shamed him, standing when he couldn't. Then, at the store, unhitching the team in the cold, he said to the horse's flank so he wouldn't have to say it to her face, "My brother couldn't have done that. I couldn't have done that." A pause. "You count what they'll grow." He shook his head once. "Where's a person even learned to say a thing like that?" "Behind a counter," she said. "Same as you learned horses." She thought she saw him almost smile. She wasn't sure. It was dark. The season turned toward planting, and the store's whole gamble came into focus, and it was this. The note was due in the fall, and the only way to pay a fall note was a fall harvest. And the only way there was a harvest was if the farmers could get seed in the ground in the spring. But they had no cash for seed. Pruitt would sell them seed only for cash. So the men were caught, no seed without money, no money without a crop, no crop without seed, and it was into that trap that Della drove the first real wedge. She called it harvest share. She sat up 2 nights working it out on paper. The store would advance a man his seed and his feed in the spring against a fixed share of the crop it grew, settled at market price at harvest, the terms written plain and the same for every man so nobody could say he'd been favored or cheated. It put the store's neck out. If the crop failed, the store ate the loss. But it meant a man with no dollar to his name could still plant, and a man who could plant could still hope, and hope was the one thing Pruitt's cash box could not sell. The first man it saved was Tom Dabney. The Dabneys were 3 miles out on poor ground, and they were one bad season from the auction block. Pruitt already had the smell of them. He'd been by twice, cash only. Knowing full well they had no cash, waiting for the fall so he could pick the farm up cheap the way he'd picked up half the county. Della rode out herself with the harvest share papers. She found Tom Dabney in a bare kitchen with a wife and 4 children, and a look on his face she knew. She'd worn it herself the day the bank took her father's store. The look of a man doing sums that never come out. She laid the terms on the table. Seed and feed, advanced. A share at harvest, no more. His farm his own. He read it 3 times because he could not believe a store would carry the risk, and then Tom Dabney, a grown man in front of a woman he barely knew, had to turn to the window for a minute and could not speak. His wife signed for them both while he got himself back. When Della rode out, their oldest boy ran alongside her horse to the road, just running, glad about something he was too young to name. She came back to the store after dark, cold through, and found Silas had left her supper on the stove. A plate of beans kept warm, and had not eaten himself. She noticed the flour barrel then, noticed how low it was, and noticed it was low because he'd been stretching it, thinning the store's own stock to keep the tab customers fed, going without at his own table so the men who owed could eat. He hadn't said a word about it. He never said a word about the cost of anything he carried. She ate half the beans and set the plate in front of him and said, "A man can't work a store on air. Sit down." "That's yours," he said. "It's ours," she said, and heard the word as she said it, and so did he. "Sit down, Silas." He sat. She fried the last of the salt pork and cut the last of the bread, and they ate together at the little table in the back room. The first meal she had cooked in that house for the 2 of them, and somewhere in the middle of it he told her a story about his brother and a runaway mule and the mayor's flower bed, and it was a foolish story, and she laughed, out loud. It surprised them both. She had not laughed since before her father died. He looked at her laughing like a man who's found water on dry land. And then he looked down at his plate quick, the way he'd looked away from the safe. And she didn't know yet that those 2 turnings away were the same man protecting the same thing. The next morning she came down to find him with a plane in his hand and the front door off its hinges across 2 sawhorses. He'd taken the warp door down, the one that had stuck and dragged for years, that everyone shouldered through out of habit, and he was planing it true, long clean curls of pine coming up under the blade. "Door stuck since my brother's time," he said, not looking up, working the plane. "Figured, if the bell's going to ring." He stopped. His ears went red. "When there's cause for it to ring, I mean. Door ought to open clean." He hung it back before noon, and it swung sweet and silent and shut without a shudder for the first time in a decade. He did not hang the bell. That was hers to hang, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. The store began to turn. Slowly, then not so slowly. Word of harvest share moved along the section roads faster than any advertisement Pruitt could buy, because a man who's been carried tells every man he meets. Farmers who'd taken cash-only terms at the depot because they had no choice found they had a choice now. And they made it, and the stuck door that swung clean now started to swing often. Not busy yet, but alive. The shelves filled back in. The new ledger thickened with real accounts, ruled and dated and true. And across Main Street, in his cash and carry depot with its full stock and its empty aisles, Harlan Pruitt watched the door of Renner's swing, and counted, and decided the note wasn't moving fast enough to do the job on its own. What Della did not know What Silas did not know, what nobody in that store knew, was that Pruitt had gone quiet to Omaha. He had sat down with the Continental Farmers Trust and made them an offer on their Harmon County paper. All of it, the small notes and the large. And he had come away holding more of the county's debt than any single man had a right to hold. He wasn't waiting for Renner's to fail on its own anymore. He meant to reach in and fail it himself at the moment it would hurt the most, which any man who buys paper for a living knows is the eve of harvest, when everything a farmer has is standing green in the field and none of it is money yet. He held the store note. He was buying up the men's notes one by one to squeeze the harvest sharecrops before they could be sold. And there was one more piece of paper he was quietly working to acquire. A fourth folded sheet that would matter more than all the rest. The audience knows this. The two people in the store did not. What Della did know was that things were, for the first time in a long time, tending upward, and that she did not trust it. She had learned young that the world lets a useful woman work only until the work is done, and then it thanks her and takes back the ledger. Every good day in that store, every full shelf, every clean swing of the mended door, she read two ways at once: as a store coming back to life, and as her own usefulness running out. Because that was the deal, wasn't it? He'd married her head to save the store. And the store was getting saved. She caught herself, one evening, hanging back at the counter after close with the brass bell in her two hands, thinking about whether to hang it over the door at last. And she set it back down silent, exactly where it had sat since the day she came. Not yet, she told herself. And could not have told you whether she meant the store wasn't busy enough yet, or that she was afraid the day she hung that bell would be the day she'd finally made herself unnecessary. She was still standing there when Silas came in from the back with something in his fist, awkward, holding it out to her the way he'd held his hat in her doorway that first morning. A little tin, horehound drops. The old-fashioned kind, from the candy jar, the kind her father used to keep. "You had a cough," he said, "all week. Heard you at the ledger, coughing." He pushed the tin at her. "For your throat. It's nothing. It come out of the store stock, I'll mark it paid." He was already turning to go, embarrassed past bearing. Anyhow, she stood holding the little tin of horehound drops in the empty store, and something in her that had been braced for a year to be discarded did not know what to do with a man who noticed her cough. She wanted to tell him not to be kind like that. Because kindness like that was how a woman got herself believing she was kept for herself and not for her arithmetic, and Della Voss had promised herself she would never again be fool enough to believe that. She said, "Thank you, Silas," just that. And he was gone into the back before she finished saying it. 2 mornings later, Emmett Kroll came in early, before the store was rightly open, and he did not come to buy. He came to warn. He set his elbows on the clean counter and turned his hat in his hands and would not quite look at her, and Della felt the floor of the good days start to tilt before he said a word. "You hear anything?" Emmett said slowly, "about who's been buying up county paper? Down to Omaha?" "What paper?" Della said. "Careful, even, notes, farmers' notes. Some of the boys got letters this week. Their line's been sold on, bought up by a party through the Continental Trust." He finally looked at her. "It's Pruitt. Everybody knows it's Pruitt, though his name's nowhere on it. He's been buying us up quiet all spring." He nodded at the ledger under her hand, the clean full book of harvest share accounts, the whole gamble of the store. "Which means, Mrs. Renner, come fall, when your farmers' crops come in, the man they'll owe isn't just their old debts. It's him. And if he calls those notes before the crop's sold." Emmett didn't finish. He didn't have to. Della could do the sum faster than any man alive, and she had already done it, and it came out the way all Pruitt's sums came out. The store had bet everything on the harvest paying it back. And Pruitt had just quietly bought the right to reach into that harvest first. She stood very still behind the counter with her hand flat on the ledger she'd built night by night. The book that was supposed to save them all, and she understood that it might be the very rope that hanged them. And a small cold voice underneath even that, a voice she hated, whispered the other thing. If it all comes apart now, if the store goes down anyway, then what was she kept for? What was she worth the day the arithmetic failed? She looked past Emmett, out the clean swinging door across Main Street to the depot. Harlan Pruitt was standing in his own doorway in the morning light, watching her store the way a man watches a field he already knows he owns. He raised one hand. Not a wave. Just a hand, lifted, easy as Sunday. Della did not lift hers back. She reached instead for her coat, and her hat, and the reticule with the store's few dollars in it, because there was one card left to play and she was done waiting for the fall to play it. And she said to Emmett Kroll, without quite knowing yet the whole shape of what she meant to do, "How early does the railhead agent take callers?" The railhead agent at Corliss took callers at 7 if a body was willing to stand in the cold and mean it. Della meant it. She was on the platform when he came down with his lantern, and she did not waste his time with weather. "You've got the county co-op seed and feed coming through here all fall," she said. "Every sack of it routed to whoever the grain men name as agent. I'd like to be named." He set the lantern on the freight scale. He was a railroad man, gray at the jaw, not given to surprise. "Pruitt's the standing agent," he said. "Cash and carry. Been that way 3 years. Pruitt takes his cut off the top and pays the farmer last," Della said. "I'll take no cut. I'll advance the seed against the crop and settle at harvest, farmer first. Renner's feed and seed. Put the whole supply through my counter, and I'll carry the paper myself." The agent looked at her a long moment. Wind came down the tracks and worried the hem of her coat. "You're the one married Renner," he said. "The bookkeeper." "I'm the one who keeps the books. Yes, on whose signature does this go?" "Mine," she said. "Della Renner. In my own hand." He rubbed his jaw. Somewhere back of the depot a kettle was going, and the smell of it, chicory and smoke, reached them both. "Pruitt won't like it." "No," Della said. "He won't." That, more than anything, seemed to decide him. He'd carried Pruitt's cut on his own freight bills for 3 years, and no railroad man loves the toll taker. He went inside and came back with the co-op standing contract. And he laid it on the scale where the lantern caught it, and he turned it to face her. Della read every line before she signed. She always read every line. Then she took the pen and wrote her name across the bottom, firm and level, the way her father had taught her to write it before she could reach the counter. The agent blotted it and signed under her. "Noon train brings the first of it Thursday," he said. "You'll want a big floor." "I've got a big floor," Della said. "It's been standing empty 2 years. It won't be empty long." She folded her copy into her reticule and walked the 3 miles back to Corliss with the sun coming up behind her, and she was not cold anymore. Silas was sweeping the boards when she came in. He stopped with the broom half lifted. He'd been up all night too, she could see it on him, the salt at his temples darker with the wet comb, the shirt he'd worn yesterday. He looked at her coat, at the reticule she set on the counter beside the silent brass bell. "Where'd you go before light?" he said. Not sharp, just needing to know. She took the folded contract out and smoothed it flat on the new clean ledger. "I bought us the county," she said. He came around the counter and read it. His lips moved over the lines the way they did, slow, a man with no head for figures reading past his own limit because it mattered. When he got to her name at the bottom, he stopped. "You signed this yourself," he said. "I did." Della, it was the first time. Not Mr. Renner and Mrs. Renner, the two of them careful across a courthouse desk. Just her name in his mouth, plain, like he'd forgotten to be careful. "Pruitt's been the seed agent 3 years. You took it right out of his hand." "Out of his hand," she agreed. At 7 this morning, Silas set the broom against the counter. He looked at the empty floor of the store, the floor his brother had let go dark. And she watched him see it the way she'd seen it, not empty. Waiting, then we'd best build shelving, he said. Before Thursday. They built shelving before Thursday. And Thursday the noon train came in loud, and the first wagons of co-op seed came off it, and the county came with them. It started slow, the way a good rain starts. 2 wagons the first day. Then Emmett Kroll brought his boys and his neighbor, and the neighbor told another. And by the second week there was no such thing as a slow morning at Renner's Feed and Seed. The harvest share terms did what Della had built them to do. A man short of cash could take his seed and his feed against the crop, sign Della's book, and drive home with his planter full and his pride whole. Pruitt's depot across the street took only cash. In the fall of 1934 in Harmon County, there was precious little cash and a great deal of coming crop. So they came to her. The brass bell that had sat silent on the counter, her mother's bell, rung 20 years over the door of a store the bank took. Della finally hung it on the frame. Silas hung it. And the first time a farmer pushed in with a want list in his fist, the bell rang, clean and bright. And Silas looked up from the feed scale and Della looked up from the book, and neither of them said a word about it. But the bell rang the next man in, and the next. And by October it rang so steady you stopped hearing it, the way you stop hearing your own heart. They worked shoulder to shoulder. That was the thing of it. She'd married him for a roof and a name and the right to have her mind be worth something, and she'd braced, from the first day, to be set aside the minute the arithmetic was done. That was the sum she'd carried her whole life. A woman was kept for her use. When the use was spent, she went back on the shelf, like her father's store. Like the bell before Silas hung it. But the use was never done, and Silas never set her aside. He remembered she took chicory, not coffee, and there was a pot of it warm by the register every morning before she asked. He planed the front door, the warped door that had stuck and dragged for years, since before his brother, planed it down one Sunday with the store closed, sweating over it. So it swung clean and the bell rang true instead of catching. He said it was for the bell. She knew it was for her, so she wouldn't have to shoulder it every time her hands were full of another man's ledger. One night in late October she fell asleep over the books. She'd been footing the harvest share column, 40 accounts and climbing, and the lamp had burned down to a stub, and she put her head down on the ledger just to rest her eyes. When she woke the lamp was out and there was a weight across her shoulders, and it was his coat. His good coat, the one he wore to the Grange. He was gone up to bed, and he'd left her the light burning by the stair and his coat over her sleeping shoulders, and he'd said nothing, because he was a private man and he had no words for it, and the coat said it for him. Della sat a long while in the dark under his coat. She thought about the sum she'd carried her whole life. And for the first time she let herself wonder if she'd carried it wrong. Pruitt came at her sideways, the way such men do. He caught her alone at the depot counter one afternoon when she'd walked over to check the freight bill. He was cordial. He was always cordial, the way a hawk is patient. He leaned on his own empty counter, and it was empty, his depot, more and more. While the line ran out her door across the street, and he made her an offer in a low, even voice, one businessman to another. "You've got the best head for figures in 3 counties, Mrs. Renner," he said. "It's wasted on a feed store. I'll put you over my whole operation. Manager, a salary, a real one, cash money, every Friday, in your own name and no man's roof required." He let that sit. "You'd not have to earn your keep by mending some farmer's book. You'd draw wages for your mind." "I draw plenty for my mind," Della said. "Do you?" Pruitt smiled. Renner married a ledger, Mrs. Renner. Everybody in Harmon County knows it. He was weeks from the nail and he found a woman who could count. That's a business arrangement, same as mine. Only I'd pay you what the arrangement's worth. He tipped his head toward the store across the street, the bell going, the line moving. He got all that for a roof and a name. Seems to me the arithmetic favors the wrong party. It was a well-made cut. Pruitt made good cuts. It went straight in under the place she'd braced her whole life, the cold small voice that said she was kept for her use and no more. Married a ledger. She heard it walking back across the street. She heard it setting down the freight bill. She heard it that night over supper, and she was quiet, and Silas noticed she was quiet. And being a private man, he said nothing, which was, that once, exactly the wrong thing. She refused Pruitt. She never for a moment considered taking it. But the doubt he'd planted put down a root, and it waited, the way such roots do, for dry weather. Dry weather came the eve of harvest. It was a Tuesday morning, 8:15, the bell just warming up for the day, when Harlan Pruitt walked into Renner's Feed and Seed and laid 2 papers on the counter beside the brass bell. He laid them flat and turned them to face her, the way she'd turned the contract to face the railhead agent. He'd learned that from watching her, maybe, he did nothing without watching first. The first paper was the store note, $1,140. Across the top, stamped in red, was one word. Demand called, Pruitt said. In full. Continental Farmers Trust of Omaha holds this note now, Mrs. Renner. Bought it off your bank in the spring. I speak for Continental in this county. He was not smiling now. This was the part he'd waited all year for, and he took it slow, to taste it. 60 days was the old term. That term's void. It's due today. Cash. Della's hands were flat on the counter. She did not move them. The crop's not in, she said. You know the crop's not in. It comes in this week. Every account in my book settles at harvest. Your book, Pruitt said, is paper. This is a note. And he slid the second paper up beside the first and turned it too, so the light caught the red stamp. Demand. It was not the store note. It was a mortgage. On the home place. On the Renner quarter section, 40 years Renner land, free and clear. The farm Silas had shown her the day she came. The deed he'd laid out in the safe with the store papers. Farms free and clear, he'd said, and shut the second folded paper back quick, and she hadn't looked, because it wasn't hers to look at, because she trusted him. The second folded paper. She understood it standing there. The paper he'd put away quick. He'd mortgaged the land. Months ago. To Continental. To keep the store breathing while she rebuilt it, he'd put the family ground under the same trust that was now stamping it red, and he had never told her. She'd built the busiest counter in Harmon County, standing on ground she didn't know was sinking. And the man had married her head and kept the truth from her heart. She heard the bell ring behind Pruitt. A farmer coming in. The ordinary sound of the ordinary morning, going on. Ask your husband, Pruitt said, gathering his hat, why he never showed you that one. A man doesn't hide the safe from a partner. He set his card on the counter, the way he had the first day. Both notes. Do. I'll take the store when it fails, and the land after. You'll have kept his books all the way down to the nail. He touched his hat. A woman's got no note worth carrying, Mrs. Renner. I told you that on your own father's porch. You should have believed me the first time. He left. The bell rang him out, clean through the door Silas had planed. Silas came from the back and saw the 2 papers and saw her face, and he did not need her to say it. His own face went gray under the salt. Della, months ago, she said. Very quiet. You put the land under. And you sat across the supper table from me every night since, and you let me foot the column, and you never said. I could have carried it in the numbers, Silas. If I'd known the true numbers, I could have carried it. That's the one thing I'm for. And you hid it from me. I didn't want you to carry it, he said. It was mine to carry. Yours. She heard the cold small voice come up out of the place Pruitt had rooted it. Married a ledger. Kept for her use, and not trusted past it. You wanted my arithmetic. You didn't want your wife. There's a difference, and I've spent my whole life on the wrong side of it, and I told myself this once it was different. She took her coat off the peg. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. I fixed your store. I bought your county. I'll not stand in a house that keeps its true books from me." She left the brass bell silent on the counter. She did not ring it. She walked out into the harvest morning the same way she'd walked out of her father's store the day the bank took it, with her chin level and her eyes dry, because she'd cried herself out on that first porch years ago and had none left to spend on this one. She got as far as the edge of town. Tom Dabney's place was 3 miles out. Poor ground, 4 children. The farm she'd saved from Pruitt's auction with the harvest share note in the spring. She stood at the edge of Corliss with her coat buttoned, and she thought about Tom Dabney's 4 children. She thought about the 40 families in her book. 40 accounts that settled at harvest, 40 men who'd signed her ledger instead of Pruitt's because she'd given them terms that let them keep their pride. If she walked, the store failed today, the notes took it, and the 40 families lost the only credit in the valley that wasn't Harlan Pruitt's. Her wound was hers. The 40 families were the county's. She'd been kept for her use her whole life, and she'd hated it. But there was a difference, she saw now, standing cold at the edge of town, between being used and being of use. One a man does to you, the other you choose. Her father had chosen it every morning of his life, sweeping a store that carried its neighbors through 2 bad winters. She was his daughter. She came back at dawn the next day, harvest day. She let herself in with her own key, and she lit the lamp, and she opened the book to the harvest share column, 40 accounts. And she made the store ready to be paid. She did not speak to Silas, who had been up all night in the same chair, who stood when she came in and did not dare come near. She set her coat on the peg. She set the tin of horehound drops he'd once left her on the sill back in her apron pocket. Because it was hers, and she was staying, for the 40 families, whatever came after. The harvest came in on a Tuesday. It came in the way a flood comes, all at once, the whole county's crop off the fields, in the same 3 days God gives you before the weather turns, and every wagon of it rolled into Corliss, and every wagon of it stopped at Renner's Feed and Seed first. That was the thing Pruitt never understood. He believed a farmer feels only his debt, never his loyalty. He'd said it once, that farmers pay whoever holds the paper and no one else. But a farmer knows who carried him. Tom Dabney knew. He drove in at first light with his boys, and his 4 children washed and combed on the wagon seat, and he came to Della's counter with his crop money in a tin box. And he laid it down before he owed it anywhere else on earth. "Pruitt's man come by my place Sunday," Dabney said. "Wanted me to settle at the depot. Said the note there was called, and I'd best pay the note holder direct." He pushed the tin box across the boards. "I told him I settle where I'm carried. I'm carried here." The bell rang behind him. Emmett Kroll, and behind Emmett the neighbor, and behind the neighbor a line of wagons that ran down Main Street past the depot windows, 40-odd farmers with their crop money, come to pay the store first. The bell rang and rang. It rang so steady you couldn't count it. Della footed the column with the coins going into the drawer and the drawer filling, and Silas hauling seed for the spring at the same counter, the 2 of them working shoulder to shoulder without a word, because the work was the one language they'd never lost. By noon the store note was covered. $1,140. In coin and worn bills, and one man's last silver dollar laid down like a sacrament. By 3 the home place mortgage was covered too. By dusk there was a surplus. A real surplus. The first the store had seen in the 6 years since Silas's brother let it start to die. And across the street, Pruitt's cash-only depot stood dark. Not a wagon at it. Not a man. He'd called the county's notes, and the county had driven straight past his door to pay the woman he said had no note worth carrying. Emmett Kroll climbed up on the loading step at dusk with the lantern and the tally sheet, because the men wanted it read out, and Emmett was the co-op chair and it was his to read. He held the lantern up and he read the figure of the day's settling. And then he read the thing under it that made the men take off their hats. "That's the store note paid," Emmett said, his old voice carrying down the line. "That's the land note paid. And that's a surplus over both." He lowered the sheet. "I been in this county 60 years. I never seen a counter move what this counter moved today. Boys, this here's the busiest store in Harmon County. Ain't a man can say different. The men who'd balked at her that spring, who'd called her the farmer's bought bride at the co-op meeting, stood in the lantern light and touched their hats to Della Renner in the doorway. Every one of them. That was when the trust's agent came up the street. He'd come down on the noon train from Omaha to take a failing store for Continental Farmers Trust. And he'd walked into a county that had just paid its every note in a single day. He was a bankman, and bankmen read a ledger the way Della read one, fast and to the bottom line. He stood in the lantern light and he looked at the surplus, and he looked at the line still moving, and he looked across the street at Pruitt's dark and empty depot. Pruitt was on his own step. He'd come out to watch his triumph and stayed to watch the other thing. The agent took the demand papers out of his own coat, the store note and the home place mortgage, both stamped red, and he held them up so the whole street could see, and he tore them across. Once, twice, he dropped the pieces on the boards. Continental doesn't foreclose a store that pays, he said, plain, to the county. This is where the county's money runs. A bank follows the money. He turned toward Pruitt on his dark step. Mr. Pruitt, you sold Continental a county on the theory these people default. They didn't. You've cost the trust a season and made us the fool in a town that'll remember it. He put on his hat. Continental will buy out your interest in the Harmon County paper. All of it. At a discount, for our trouble. You're done as our man here. He looked once more at the line, the bell, the full drawer. The trust would rather bank with her. Pruitt did not answer. There was nothing in the arithmetic to answer with. He'd bet a county owed him and forgot a county loved elsewhere. He stood a moment in the lantern light, the man who'd told a girl on her father's porch that a woman's note wasn't worth carrying, watching 40-odd farmers carry hers past his empty door. Then he turned and walked into his dark depot, and he shut the door, and no bell rang him in, because he'd never hung one. Silas came up onto the loading step where Emmett had stood. He was not a man who spoke before a crowd. He'd married so he wouldn't have to. But he stood up before the same co-op that had mocked him for buying a wife in front of the whole county, with the torn notes on the boards at his feet, and he made himself do it. Most of you know my store was weeks from the nail last winter, he said. His voice wasn't smooth. It caught. You know I've no head for figures. What you don't know, he stopped. Started again. What you don't know is that back in the spring I mortgaged the home place. The Renner quarter, 40 years free and clear, and I put it under, to Continental, to keep this store's doors open one more season. And I never told my wife. She built you the busiest counter in the county standing on ground I'd let sink under her, and she didn't know it, because I was too proud to say I couldn't carry it alone. He looked at them. All of them, that's the shame, and it's mine, and I'll not hide it in the safe anymore. A man that hides the true books isn't strong, he's just alone. He turned to Della in the doorway. You said you'd not stand in a house that keeps its books from you. You were right to say it. He reached into his coat and took out a folded paper. A new one, clean, no red stamp. I had the deed to the home place redrawn yesterday. It's in 2 names now. Yours first. He held it out, and his hand was not steady, his the way hers were always steady. Not for your arithmetic, Della. I've got the store back and I could hire arithmetic tomorrow. I'm not asking you to keep my books. He got the word out. Stay, because I can't do the ordinary days without you across the counter. Stay for yourself. Stay. The county was quiet. The bell was still. Della came out of the doorway and crossed the boards to the counter where her mother's brass bell had sat silent since the morning Pruitt laid the notes down. She took it up. She rang it. It rang clean and bright and long, clean through the door he'd planed smooth so it never caught. And it rang out over Main Street, over the full drawer and the torn notes and the line of wagons and the dark depot across the way it had rung 20 years over her father's door before the bank took it. Her mother's bell, ringing again, in a store that was hers now. Half of it. Her name first on the paper for the first time in her life. She did not say yes with a word. She'd never been one for the easy words. She said it with the bell, and Silas knew the language, and that was answer enough for them both. 1 year on, the store was the beating heart of Harmon County. The bell rang all day over the plain door. The harvest share book had grown so thick Della started a second one, and the accounts in it settled clean every fall now. Farmer first, the way she'd built it. Continental banked with her, cordial and cash on time, and asked her twice a year would she come to Omaha and run a department, and twice a year she said no. She had a county to keep. The home place put in its first free and clear harvest in a generation, gold to the fence line, Renner land 40 years and now 41, in 2 names. In the back room there was a table set for 2. A buttery lamp on the ledger. Closed for the night, the day's work squared. 2 plates. The tin of horehound drops on the sill where the last of the light came in. The chicory pot rinsed and ready for morning. His coat on the peg beside her coat. The door swung easy, and the bell hung still, resting, the way a heart rests between beats. Harlan Pruitt still passed through Corliss now and again. Continental had bought him out to the last dollar of county paper, and he ran a smaller depot 2 towns over now, cash and carry, and no line at his door. He'd tip his hat to Della on the street, because he was a cordial man to the end. And she'd nod because she was her father's daughter, and her father was civil to everyone, even the men who took his store. One morning he stopped her by the mercantile and said, mild as ever, that she'd made a fine thing of the store. A fine thing. And it was almost a shame, the way it all had fallen out. He was fishing. He always fished. Della settled her basket on her arm and looked at him. At the man who'd once counted her worth to her face on her own father's porch. You were right about one thing, Mr. Pruitt, she said. You told me a woman's got no note worth carrying. She let the bell of the store sound faintly down the street between them, ringing another farmer in. You were right. A woman's got no note worth carrying. She stepped past him toward home. She's got a whole county's. She left him on the walk and went back to the store, and the bell rang her in. Clean through the door her husband planed, and she took her place behind the counter where her mother's bell hung ready, and the day's work began. The way it began every day, 2 pairs of hands. Because some things are only worth what 2 pairs of hands build together. A store, a county's credit, a marriage that starts as an arrangement on a courthouse desk and turns. Ledger line by plain door by coat, laid over sleeping shoulders into the truest thing either one of them ever kept. If you've watched this far, then wherever you're watching from, comment your town, your city, the little place with the store on its main street, and tell me who in your life is the second pair of hands.